So how did this come to you, Get Well Network? And I mean, I believe I get what the problem is, but I'd like to hear it from you. The biggest
Sure.
problem
Yeah,
you're
this will sound a
solving.
little bit mundane, but probably something that those of us who have been in a hospital bed probably will feel is pretty common. I was laying in a hospital bed at Johns Hopkins Hospital in
Mhm.
Baltimore for
Yep.
9 days back in 1999, and I was
Mhm.
actually waiting for my pathology to come back from a surgery that cut out about half my stomach to remove a tumor. And I was sitting there. Honestly, I just come from grad school, and in a world where we have so much information, empowerment at our fingertips, I was laying there so uncomfortable, afraid, anxious, confused, just clamoring, for information to understand what all these crazy acronyms were. And
Sure.
and and honestly, I sat in this bed staring at a 15-year-old TV in the corner of my room that was just spinning like 12 channels, on it. And my observation was pretty blunt. It was, what if we actually turn this lazy asset, the patient television, into a desktop, and I actually had information that I could really use, to kind of help me make the best decision for myself. And that was really kind of what spurred a bunch of work as I went back to grad school to figure
Interesting.
this whole thing out.
So at that point, I mean, the skeptic in me says doctors don't want you to be able to figure out what's wrong with you or try to contribute to your own care.
Listen, it's so funny. I was talking to somebody. I was up in Philadelphia last
Yeah.
week during the Magnet Nursing Conference and speaking to about 100 nurse leaders about this very, very topic.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is, hey, look, at Get Well Network, it took us 13 years to get 30 organizations to become clients, and then
Holy
5 years
smokes.
to get 500 more. Right. So this has been anything but an overnight success. And part
Well,
of it is sort of
sure.
what you just said, like
Yeah.
an active, empowered, engaged patient sounds like a good idea until you actually have them,
That's right.
barking at you about how much they know about their care. But I will tell you, to the credit of the physicians and nurses, they do know that a well-informed, engaged patient is a better patient, and we're more
Really.
likely to have better outcomes. And the question
Why
is
is
how,
that? Yeah.
well, because one of the biggest challenges in healthcare is having patients kind of adhere to their plan of care,
The
and so when
protocols. Yeah,
we
sure.
miss
Yeah.
meds and we missed appointments and we
Right.
miss surgery follow-ups, those things result in like really poor care, for the
Yeah.
patient and a lot of headache, for the organization and the clinicians. And so the good thing is conceptually we're aligned. The question is how do you put the right set of mutual tools that benefit each other in the
Mhm.
process to really
Mhm.
make sure it becomes a flywheel benefit, not,
Mhm.
a distractor, if you will, of the care.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it's interesting that you mentioned that because I have a friend who had bladder cancer some before I knew her, and during COVID and the disaster we all just lived through for the last 2 years or so, she neglected to go to her follow up appointment, and her cancer came back. Her every
Yep.
2 year follow up. Fortunately, they were able to catch it, but I think that's what I'm hearing from you is really, how do you keep people engaged in that when there's just all this other stuff going on, like a pandemic that's, ruining everybody's life basically.
Yeah, yeah, Carol. I will tell you what I noticed in my own care, and then what certainly we have noticed with now the 10 million
Mhm.
or so patients that we have an opportunity and privilege to kind of touch now annually. It's interesting. The clinical care has gotten fairly consistently excellent as far as like the physicians and nurses
Mhm.
knowing what the best path for you to follow is.
Right,
The
right.
challenge in healthcare is that the darn system is so complicated that it's really around experience, navigation, and retention, and
Mhm.
so the clinical plan is clear. Whether or not the patient and the care team are coordinated in the effective execution of that plan is a whole other story. And
Mhm.
so in our work at Get Well, we feel like we have this incredible opportunity to find a way to leverage technology and compassion and create what we would call digital intimacy to really help
Mhm.
patients feel like they're personally being navigated and they're actively involved in their care. And the outcomes, candidly, are consistent and they're powerful.
Right. So you've taken over the years about 19 million in investment, correct?
So at this point, we've now taken more than that. So we did a fairly typical venture capital run in '04, '07, and '09.
Okay.
And then the business actually, we sold the business to a large private equity firm in New York in 2013.
Ah,
And so our venture guys kind of got out of the business. They were very
sure.
happy. I'm kind of like a made guy in the venture world. So you can begin to do a bunch of other things that you want to go
Yep.
impact, which has been fun.
Yep.
And then we actually built the company further with a private equity firm. And then we actually and bought our biggest competitor and did some integration work, did some work globally.
Mhm.
And then we actually had another turn into another private equity firm. And so at this point, we
Right.
certainly have raised a lot more than the $19 million, but it's been a couple
Mhm.
of turns. And but
Yep.
for me and candidly, my family and my partners, it's just like an every 5 year financing transaction. This is kind of life work. And so we just kind of push the chips back in and we keep rolling. It's kind of how it is that we deal with it.
Got it. So when you look back and look at your first round that you took, what had investors excited about what you were up to?
I think a couple things. We were coming off, it was not easy. Those of us who are old enough to know that the internet bubble, when it burst, was a very real thing in
Right.
2001. I founded the company in August of 2000. So the timing could not
Okay.
have been
Yeah. Well,
worse.
yeah. It's
And then the
always
timing for
something.
raising money could not have been worse. But so
Yeah.
what we did is we raised $1 million from friends and family, and then we
Mhm.
literally stretched it for 4 years. And so you can
Wow.
imagine like taking $1 million, having no revenue, and figuring out a way
Yeah. Well.
to truly inch along and eat, ramen noodles, all the typical cliche things you read in founders' books. They actually happen,
Yeah.
that way. And so we stretched it, and then when we finally raised institutional money, we raised it all off of really two core things. One was we had our first two contracts in, and while we didn't even have a product yet, what we had was organizations saying, "We know patient engagement is important. We
Mhm.
haven't found a way to do it well at scale, and we would love your help, in co-innovating a way to kind of do this work." So that was
Right.
important to us. And the second thing is honestly, I think, and it's I think a good thing. I do a handful of talking in a bunch of business schools and talk a lot of new entrepreneurs, and I think that our passion and our focus was relentless. Like we believed that as hard as the industry was going to be on us, that we
Mhm.
were going to succeed because the work mattered
Mhm.
and nothing was
Mhm.
going to stop us. And so we were just
Right.
relentless in our pursuit of finding people who actually shared that vision. And I think investors responded to that, thankfully.
You mentioned two private equity transactions, right? The first, then the second, which you're current owners. I'm assuming.
Yeah.
Um, how did that? I mean, at least the first time you sold, how did that? Here's a guy who founded his own company, and now he's selling it to somebody else, and still acting as the CEO.
Yeah.
I mean, that's giving up that kind of control is not always so easy. So how did you, I'm curious about a second private equity transaction, why that happened.
Yeah.
Was it because the first one just wasn't a fit?
Yeah. So let me take it one at a time. So
Yeah.
the first one, this is kind of an ironic thing for entrepreneurs. At a time where your company is about to be sold to a private equity firm,
Mm,
where your venture capitalists are going to make a
a
great
lot of, yeah.
return,
Yeah,
at a
sure.
time where you think you'd be most confident on the balls of your feet, I went through some really unfamiliar moments of insecurity.
Mm,
Because in a private equity firm, there are not a lot of founder CEOs floating around in these companies, right? Like most of the
no, they're
times
not.
when they buy them, they say, "Hey, we love the company you built. Um, and we would love you
Yeah.
to kind of just exit stage left and give us some parting thoughts and all." And so it was a really
Yeah.
interesting psychological time. And I remember, really leaning heavily on my wife and my partner around this whole thing and really saying, "Hey, look, I think I'm the very best person on the planet to lead this work forward.
Yeah.
And I need to make sure that I find that confidence with my new firm to say, hey, the
Hmm.
moment that you think or I don't think I am,
Hmm.
and let's actually talk about that openly. But like until that time, like I'm all in. And so, but it was a really interesting time. Now, on the second turn, it was quite different. On the second turn, it was simply, hey, I now had exited once. So
Hmm.
we had security behind us, expectations that were raised. I was a more mature CEO, and we were simply turning it again to get those other investors their return out. And so for us, it was more like, hey, let's go find the right partner. I've got some bigger ideas around what this thing could be in the next
Hmm.
chapter, and let's actually get you guys a great return. Let's kind of keep rolling. So it was more just a pretty natural
Hmm.
investment return transaction at that stage, candidly.
So are they pretty hands off? Or you just, just running your show? Uh, what's their business in your business?
So the operating cadence is fairly standard and
Yeah.
consistent. We are on monthly operating calls. We are on quarterly boards, and
Right.
then we were pulling them in ad hoc when we want to do a pretty big transaction. We want to acquire another company. We want to enter a new global market. You know,
Mhm.
and so, but on a day to day, we happen all the way along from venture days to our two private equity turns. We've
Mhm.
had folks that have a great balance between bringing their operational excellence and best practice to us, making sure that we're operating according to what they have seen be successful. But they really
Mhm.
give us latitude. I mean, we know the business in some cases painfully, painfully well, and so they've given me a great degree of freedom to really try to lean into like what's next and what's new because, man,
Mhm.
this world needs innovation and
No
leadership more than
kidding.
ever, and they're
Yeah.
trusting me to actually provide that for them.
Yeah. Amen. From your mouth to somebody's ears, boy. Carol Schultz here. Thanks for watching this excerpt from Authentically Successful. The conversation doesn't end there. So if you want to hear this episode in full and all my conversations with many other successful founders and CEOs, please visit verticalelevation.com/podcast.